When Joker hit cinemas in 2019, it was the right film at the right time. The perfect ingredients came together to make something that hit the cultural zeitgeist and offered a different take on the superhero genre, just as they were hitting their peak. It was a serious, dour, intense character study based on a flawed man who had been failed by the people and society around him. All this from the director of the Hangover trilogy. Who knew? Joaquin Phoenix's Joker became instantly iconic. So after it made $1 billion, becoming one of the most profitable films of all time, I, like the rest of the world, wasn't shocked when a sequel was announced, with the original team in front and behind the camera returning. But when it was announced to be a musical, I was flabbergasted. What were they thinking? I thought then as I do now, this will either be a work of genius or a complete and utter disaster, with possibly no in between. Not to mention the reported budget 4 times larger than the original, the stage may very well be set for disaster. Are the ingredients there again for another huge commercial and critical hit? Or is it simply Folie à Deux, a shared delusion, if you will, between writer and director Todd Phillips and star Joaquin Phoenix to expect that this huge gamble will pay off? Well, I have to admit, controversially perhaps, based on what does seem to be the prevailing reception of this film right now, I actually really enjoyed it. But a few things to know. First, I'm a fan of musicals in general. I love Singing in the Rain, The Sound of Music, Mary Poppins. I also thought Joker was great. Now, I imagine there is quite a small percentage of people who fall into those two categories. Just know, if you do end up going to see it, once the singing starts, it doesn't really stop. Even though I enjoyed it, the decision to make this movie into a musical in the first place is still baffling to me. It's as if the filmmakers knew this as well, as in interviews with the cast and director along with the marketing itself, there seems to have been a deliberate attempt to hide the fact that it is a musical. Who is the desired audience for this film? Lady Gaga fans perhaps? But where would they be in the Venn diagram of people who also enjoy Joker? This film worked for me, but I can absolutely understand that it really won't for the majority of people who love the first one. Having said all that, let's get to the plot. 2 years after the events of the first film, Arthur Fleck is in Arkham State Hospital, defeated, silenced, not a smile or a joke in sight. His imprisonment has taken its toll and removed any sign of Joker. His trial for the murders he committed during the first film is happening imminently. His lawyer is encouraging him to plead insanity so they can move him to a facility to treat and look after him, to say that Joker committed the crimes and he, Arthur, has no recollection and wasn't in control. All appears to be going to plan until he meets Harley Quinn, called Lee in this film. She's a fellow patient at Arkham and she gives him a new lease on life, bringing Joker back out to play and sing. Has Arthur finally found a reason to live? Or will he once again be violently flung back into a tragedy? As already mentioned, the budget for this one is significantly larger than the first, at around $200 million. After the first film's success, Warner Brothers have certainly bet big, and I imagine the expectation would have been to do another $1 billion. However, not only is the decision to make this a musical a divisive one, the landscape of superhero films and film in general has changed a lot since 2019. Gone is the heyday of every Marvel film making a guaranteed $1 billion at the box office, and there seems to be a general apathy towards the genre as a whole. Marvel have gone full quantity over quality since then, and as for DC, well, they've released The Flash. There's been this bizarre ongoing trend of marketing musicals as not musicals, with Wonka, Mean Girls, and now Wicked being the most recent example. I specifically remember sitting down to watch Wonka last year, and when Timothée Chalamet started singing, I was floored. Now, don't get me wrong, I love a good musical when it's done right, and Wonka thoroughly won me over, but this seems so disingenuous, and it's bound to annoy people. It's already annoying me. When it came to this film, you had director Todd Phillips saying in an interview with Variety, most of the music in the movie is really just dialogue. It's just Arthur not having the words to say what he wants to say, so he sings them instead. So, a musical then? That's literally what a musical is. It's when characters are unable to express their emotions through words, so instead they must do so through song. Speaking of, Joker has always been theatrical, more so in his elaborate schemes to commit crimes or foil Batman. But even so, this version's theatrical singing is jarring and certainly something that could never have been imagined if only looking at the first film in isolation. It is Lady Gaga's Lee, however, who starts Arthur on this trajectory. Shortly after meeting her, he is smitten and begins to sing, "I finally have someone who needs me" in his head after he is unable to process his emotions. As with the first film, Phoenix once again excels here, singing well enough when needed, but more importantly, retaining that through line to Arthur's complex, layered characterization whilst doing so. You once again sympathise and pity him as his traumas are laid bare, but you're also simultaneously and constantly all too aware of what's lurking underneath, waiting to come out. Phoenix does some particularly wonderful acting with his eyes here, with some very long-held close-ups of his face. A standout courtroom scene with returning Lee Gills as Gary Puddles is arguably the best in the film, with a silent, emotional climax. Phoenix brings both a vulnerability and a bravado to the role that once again encapsulates the dual contrasting personalities of both Arthur and Joker. Lady Gaga as Lee brings a wide-eyed, unblinking intensity to her character. Reminiscent of Jake Gyllenhaal's chilling performance in Nightcrawler, Lee is completely obsessed with Joker, and that comes across in her performance. Coaxing Arthur to come out of his shell, she is like a lion on the prowl for prey, and she gets her claws deep into Arthur. Lee immediately bonds with him upon their first meeting through their shared trauma, and they partake in a fantastical romance with chemistry that works well enough. Her character develops in an interesting way, with her motives not appearing as they first seem. Is she genuinely in love with Arthur, or is there something else going on behind those eyes? She's an obsessed fan of Joker, similar to real-life counterparts of women who are obsessed with serial killers. She even moves into his old apartment building so they can live there together after the trial, doing all she can to get closer to him. Brendan Gleeson plays a sadistic prison guard who enjoys asserting control. He's all Irish charm in one moment, whistling a tune, asking Arthur to tell him a joke. The next, he's slapping Arthur round the head. He's in what is perhaps the most disturbing scene of the film for me, asserting that Arthur's Joker's act is just that, and in the prison with him, he is nothing and a nobody. Lee Gills as Gary Puddles returns here for a single memorable and extremely effective scene. During a back and forth encounter in the courtroom, Gary pleads with Arthur to drop the Joker act. He's scared and is heartbroken that the one friend he had did something so horrible. "You were the only one who wasn't mean to me," echoing Arthur's own words as he let Gary leave the murder scene in that first film. Joker's facade is briefly cracked in that moment as Arthur begins to reconcile with the impact of his actions. It's heartbreaking stuff, and Lee Gills does a fantastic job. Steve Coogan makes a brief appearance, and admittedly it was a bit distracting seeing him in a serious role, as I know him best as Alan Partridge, a decidedly not serious character.
Dan! Dan!
He is great here though, a slimy interviewer trying to get a soundbite out of Arthur, you know the type. From the off he asks him, "Should I call you Joker or Arthur?" to try and bait him into incriminating himself or say something that will increase his own status. He is just using him, like everyone else. With its filmic, non-digital look, there really haven't been any other superhero films that look like this one. The close-up shots look incredible, the colours really pop with some glorious grading. It very much retains the look of the original, as does the production design. The score by Hilda
Gunnadottir
returns, along with motifs from the first film in key moments too, particularly as Joker starts to re-emerge. The jazzy, live-sounding band accompaniment elevates the singing scenes, and these musical elements, along with the tense, dread-filled strings that return, oddly work well together. Their contrast adds to the separation of reality and Arthur's fantasy world. This film, for better or worse, is uniquely its own thing. The first wore its narrative inspirations on its sleeve, with it being an obvious smash between Scorsese's The King of Comedy and Taxi Driver, both stylistically and especially narratively. This film is more like a courtroom drama crossed with Singing in the Rain. Throw in some prison drama, commentary on the media, and you have Folie à Deux. Overall, I was satisfied with Arthur's character arc in this one, and where it ends up. Like the first, it is a bit of a slow build, and its focus is still locked onto his perspective. It is more disjointed though, as the musical elements can feel like interruptions at times, bringing the plot to a halt. I found on the whole these sequences added to the drama, moved his character along, even if the plot is paused in these moments. I would however like to talk a little more about the ending and where Arthur does end up, so if you'd like to skip that, jump to the timecode on screen now. I'll give you a few seconds. Okay, spoilers. At the end of the trial, Arthur has fully accepted that there is no Joker, only Arthur, taking responsibility for his murders and completing his character arc and journey for this film. This leads to Lee and his many fans that have gathered inside the courtroom to walk out. They never cared for Arthur, only Joker. They too were using him, as so many others have throughout the film. The film ends with Arthur back at Arkham after being found guilty for his crimes. His ultimate fate is delivered by a more psychopathic, distorted version of Joker. He's a merciless killer who guts him after telling a joke about a pathetic clown who comes across a psychopath. The punchline is, "You get what you fucking deserve," as he is stabbed multiple times, as if his own words have now come back to haunt him. The psychopath laughs maniacally in the background, out of focus, as he cuts a smile into his face with the blade, while Arthur collapses and lays bleeding on the floor, mirroring the shot from the beginning of the first film after he's beaten up with his own sign. As Arthur dies, Joker is born again. If you don't like musicals, I think your opinion will certainly differ from mine. For me, the musical sequences added to the film, allowing us to delve more into Arthur's mind and how he copes with his trauma. Through his fantasies, we discover more about him. There are a few of these flights of fantasy in the first film, yes, but they are far more numerous and frequent in this one. If that does sound annoying to you, then you will be frustrated by this film. I, however, thought it really worked, adding a new layer to Arthur's character and creating a worthy successor to an already solid film. For who among us hasn't wished before in our darkest moments that we could escape our present situation and retreat into a fantasy where we are loved for who we are? Did Joker need a sequel? No, absolutely not, but I believe this did justify its existence, and certainly didn't play it safe as many sequels tend to do. Though it is bigger, I can't say it is better than the original. Although the films are so different from each other, it's hard to compare. But this film does retain the focus on Arthur's character, and I'm satisfied with his journey in this film and its conclusion. I commend the filmmakers and Warner Brothers for taking such a huge risk. I hope it pays off, but I have a feeling this film will largely alienate the audience the first film captured, and box office tracking is not looking good, with it set to open at potentially under $40 million in the US, which would be a disaster. It will be interesting to see how the discussion and discourse around this film develops in the months and years to come. It will certainly be talked about. So, have you seen Joker 2? What did you think? Do you agree with me, or do you think I'm living in a fantasy land? I'd love to discuss with you in the comments. I'll have another review coming soon, so please consider subscribing so you don't miss it. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.